Hello YouTube, welcome back. Today is the last day of the book club this summer. I cannot believe we finished tRicK MiRRor. That's such a huge accomplishment. Thanks so much for joining me. I really had a great time getting to discuss my thoughts on it as well as hear your thoughts on it, regardless of if you decided to read chronologically or if you skipped around. I feel like both methods were perfectly acceptable with this book, especially since every essay was self-contained. But yeah, even if you didn't get to read tRicK MiRRor this summer, the videos will still be there, so you can always follow along later at whatever pace you feel is comfortable for you. Alright, so let's get into this week's essay. It was called Ivy Dread, and it was about Gia's reflections on weddings and marriage. I really liked this essay because it was a lot more personal. I feel like I hadn't really seen a lot of that since her second essay, which was the one about the reality TV show she was on. And yeah, I feel like her personal experience with this essay really strengthened her writing as well as the reading experience. So she starts out talking about all the weddings that she and her boyfriend have been invited to over the years and reflects on why she personally doesn't want a wedding and does not want to get married, as well as how it's become this continuous conflict in her life, even as she tries to resist it. There was this really funny section on page 264 where she writes, "It's easy for me to understand why a person would want to get married. But, as these weddings consistently reminded me, the understanding doesn't often go both ways. Whenever someone would ask me when Andrew and I might get married, I'd demur, saying that I didn't know, maybe never, I was lazy, I didn't wear jewelry, I loved weddings but didn't want one of my own. I'd usually try to change the subject, but it never worked. People would immediately start probing, talking to me like I was hiding something, suddenly certain that I was one of those girls who'd spend years proclaiming that she was too down to earth for anything but elopement until the second she thought she could get someone to propose. Often people would launch into a series of impassioned arguments, as if I'd just presented them with a problem that needed fixing, as if I were wearing a sandwich board with 'Change my mind' written on it." So then on page 266, I actually didn't notice this while I was reading it, but this, oh my gosh, okay, this brings us back to a pattern that I kept bringing up in the first few essays, but then I didn't really see come up as much later on, but it's back. And that pattern, if you recall, was this cyclical circular pattern. So on page 266, she writes, "And I guess it's a circular situation. Like, people shouldn't take us not wanting to get married personally, but they do take it personally. Otherwise, we wouldn't have to fucking talk about it so much. And it's like the more I have to talk about it, the more it creates this problem I didn't have in the first place. Like, I've constructed this spider web of answers about why I don't want to get married that's probably concealing my actual thoughts about, like, family structure and love. And then I resent the question even more because it's stupid and predictable, and so it makes me stupid and predictable, and I have all these, like, meta-narratives in my head when the fact of the matter is that the whole thing is just transparently ridiculous, starting from the idea that a man just proposes to a woman and she's supposed to be just lying in wait for the moment he decides he's ready to commit to a situation where he statistically benefits and she statistically becomes less happy than she would be if she was single, and then she's the one who has to wear this tacky ring to signify male ownership, and she's supposed to be excited about it, this new life where doubt becomes this thing you're supposed to experience in private and certainty becomes the default affect for the entire rest of your life." Whew. I tried reading in all the italics that she put in here. I hope that was a good reading. So that was actually a piece of a monologue, I guess, that she was telling Andrew as they were talking about the topic. Okay, and then she gets into the tradition of weddings historically. I actually had no idea how young of a tradition, like, the American traditional wedding, as it's usually thought of, is. It's not that long of a tradition. And there's also apparently been, like, different trends in wedding dress styles, and that's, like, correlated with pop culture and the types of weddings people put on. So towards the end of the history section on page 274, she writes, "The industry churns on today, riding high and manic in the wake of two recent bride coronations. Kate Middleton, rigorously thin in her Alexander McQueen princess gown. $434,000. What? And Meghan Markle died in boatneck Givenchy, $265,000. Despite the economic precarity that has threatened the American population since the 2008 recession, weddings have only been getting more expensive. They remain an industry-dictated theme park of upward mobility, as Naomi Wolf put it, a world defined by the illusion that everyone within it is upper middle class. This illusion is formalized further by the social media era, in which clothes and backdrops are routinely sought out and paid for in large part to broadcast the impression of cachet. Weddings have long existed in this sort of performative ecosystem. A great set of wedding photographs can be called upon to justify all the expense that preceded them, and the anticipation of acquiring a good set of photographs can also encourage that expense in the first place. Rebecca Mead writes in One Perfect Day, The Selling of the American Wedding. Ooh, okay, and this is like a really interesting part to me. Today, Instagram encourages people to treat life itself like a wedding, like a production engineered to be witnessed and admired by an audience. Okay, so then Gia brings it back to the personal. On page 276, she writes, in middle school, I went on my first date, dropped off at the mall for a romantic matinee showing of the Adam Sandler vehicle Big Daddy. Around then, I started to desperately want guys to like me. At the same time, I was repulsed by the predictability of that desire. In high school, I carried on a series of intense male friendships and odd secretive dalliances, and mostly within a graduating class of 90 people who had all gone to school together for a decade, I didn't date. In college, I fell in love very quickly with a guy who all but moved into my apartment in the fall of my second year when I was 17. Around then, I recounted one of our conversations in my live journal. He was telling me what scares him, that he's just fulfilling the part of, you know, like the left-wing existentialist college boyfriend, after which I settled down with the marriage type. What I told him, and what I really think, is that what are we all ever doing except playing a part that fulfills a role at its appropriate time? This is the only time the word marriage occurs in the entire archive, which covers my whole adolescence. Watching myself obliviously shift a personal tension into an abstract social inquiry, I can glimpse, for a second, a shadow of all the things I've neglected to admit to myself in the elaborate project of justifying what I want. Wow. So on page 279, there's another part I highlighted that's kind of connected to that. I now understand that it is an extremely ordinary and unremarkable thing to feel overwhelmed by weddings, or even averse to them. As a society, we do not lack for evidence that weddings are often superficial, performative, excessive, and annoying. There is a strong strain of wedding hatred in our culture underneath all the fanaticism. The hatred and fanaticism are, of course, intertwined. Love that duality. Oh yeah, that was another pattern that I noticed come up in a lot of these essays. Ooh, okay, this part is interesting. I feel like it's kind of a tangent though, but interesting. Okay, so then she brings in the historic legacy of marriages and the gendered consequences that they have. This is on page 282. Historically, marriage has mostly been bad for women and fantastic for men. Confucius defined a wife as someone who submits to another. Assyrian law declared a man may flog his wife, pluck her hair, strike her, and mutilate her ears. There is no guilt. In early modern Europe, writes Stephanie Kuntz in Marriage: A History, a husband could force sex upon his wife, beat her, and imprison her in the family home while it was she who endowed him with all of her worldly goods. The minute he placed that ring upon her finger, he controlled any land she brought to the marriage, and he owned outright all of her movable property as well as any income she later earned. The legal doctrine of coverture, which held that, as Sir William Blackstone put it in 1753, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is incorporated or consolidated into that of her husband, was implemented in the Middle Ages and was not fully dismantled in America until the late 20th century. Until 1974, women were frequently required to bring their husbands with them while applying for a credit card. Until the 80s, legal codes in many states specified that husbands could not be held responsible for raping their wives. Ugh. See, I knew that the consequences of marriage were skewed and that skew was gendered, for sure. I knew that. But when she writes in all of these details about it, it makes me so mad. It surprises me she brings this up so late in the essay. Ooh, okay, so on page 284, there's a really interesting number that I was so surprised when I read this. Today, only around 20% of Americans are married by age 29, compared to nearly 60% in 1960. What? 29? I feel like I shouldn't be surprised, but for some reason, like, 29 just, like, feels like above the average age of marriage. I don't know why. Maybe that's just because I watch too many movies. That was just so surprising to me. So basically in this part she talks about how more and more today, marriage is becoming a lot more equal than it used to be. However, on page 285, she still writes that on the whole though, the traditional wedding, meaning the traditional straight wedding, remains one of the most significant re-invocations of gender inequality that we have. There is still a drastic mismatch between the cultural script around marriage, in which a man grudgingly acquiesces to a woman salivating for a diamond, and the reality of marriage, in which men's lives often get better and women's lives often get worse. Married men report better mental health and live longer than single men. In contrast, married women report worse mental health and die earlier than single women. I had no idea. Are you serious? That's so bad. Because, okay, then she gets into like how women often change their name to their husband's last name, but even when they don't, it's like, it's so interesting how she writes about this though. Okay, let's start here. So this is page 288. Women began keeping their names in the 70s, when it became broadly possible to do so. In 1986, the New York Times began using the honorific Ms. to refer to women whose marital status was unknown, as well as to married women who wished to use their birth names. The trend of name independence peaked in the 90s, at a rather paltry 23% of married women, and today less than 20% keep their names. The decision is one of convenience, Katie Roiphe wrote at Slate in 2004. The politics are almost incidental. Our fundamental independence is not so imperiled that we need to keep our names. At this point, apologies to Lucy Stone and her pioneering work in name-keeping, our attitude is whatever works. Roiphe's laissez-faire, post-feminist view remains common. Women believe that their names are personal, not political, in large part because the decision-making around them remains so culturally restricted and curtailed. A woman keeping her name is making a choice that is expected to be limited and futile. She will not pass the name down to her children or bestow it upon her husband. At most, or so people tend to think, her last name will be crammed into the middle of her children's names, or packed around a hyphen and then later dropped for space reasons. We find it inappropriate for women to treat their names the way that men, by default, feel entitled to. On this front, as on so many others, a woman is allowed to assert her independence as long as it doesn't affect anyone else. That is so sad and like soul-crushing. Okay, continuing along. Oh no, it gets worse. So this is page 289. Gia writes, and still I wonder how much harder it would be to get straight women to accept the reality of marriage if they were not first presented with the fantasy of a wedding. I wonder if women today would so readily accept the unequal diminishment of their independence without their sense of self-importance being overinflated first. It feels like a trick that has worked and is still working, that the bride remains the image of womanhood at its most broadly celebrated, and that planning a wedding is the only period in a woman's life where she is universally and unconditionally encouraged to conduct everything on her terms. I'm literally, like, I'm livid right now. Like, I'm so mad that this is the reality. I don't know if I can film anymore. I'm, like, getting too upset over this. Oh no, it gets worse! Getting worse. Maybe it's a good thing that this is the last essay of the book. I don't know if I can do this anymore. I'm like, this is just like upsetting. Okay, I'll read it. I'll read it anyway. This is page 290. This is of course not the case for everyone, but for plenty of women, becoming a bride still means being flattered into submission. Being prepared through a rush of attention and a series of gender resegregated rituals, the bridal shower, the bachelorette party, and later the baby shower, for a future in which your identity will be systematically framed as secondary to the identity of your husband and kids. I don't have any more energy left in me to like get upset over this. Like it's so bad. This is so bad. This is so bad. Oh wow, this is so sad. Gia returns back to her personal story. She writes about the Anne of Green Gables series. Okay, so on page 291, Gia writes, I looked up Anne's House of Dreams, the 5th book in the series, and found the wedding scene. It's a September day, full of sunshine, and the chapter opens with Anne in her old room at Green Gables thinking about cherry trees and wifehood. Then she descends the stairs in her wedding dress, slender and shining-eyed, her arms full of roses. In this pivotal moment, she does not think or speak. The narration passes to Gilbert. She was his at last, he thinks. This evasive, long-sought Anne, won after years of patient waiting. It was to him she was coming in the sweet surrender of the bride. It's such a natural scene. It's lovely. It's so perversely familiar. It occurs to me that I crave independence, that I demand and expect it, but never enough since I was a teenager to actually be alone. Can you believe she just went there? She really just went there. So yeah, I think that's the last note I'll end on today. I'm like shivering. I'm like so upset with that essay. Not that it was like disturbing in like a gruesome or graphic way, but it was just so upsetting. So yeah, I would love to hear what you thought if you read it, and if not, I guess I'll just sit here alone in my discomfort with all of this information. I don't really know what to say, honestly. Thanks for watching and following along in the book club this summer. I wish I had like something more conclusive to end this video on, but as you can tell, I'm pretty shaken up by that essay and my camera is about to die. So I think I'll leave this at that. So yeah, let me know what you thought down below or in the Goodreads discussion. As always, thanks for watching. I really do appreciate everyone who followed along this summer. Oh yeah, wait, let me know if you have any suggestions for the next book we should do. I'm kind of rethinking the format of this book club just because I don't know, I feel like weekly videos were not too sustainable for me to make. As you saw in the last, I think 2 uploads, I uploaded them late, but I still do want to read books that you would also be interested in reading along with me. So let me know if you have any suggestions or just what you're planning on reading next. And yeah, thanks for watching and I will see you next time. Bye!